Welcome, everybody. It is Seth Apter. I am coming to you live from my studio in New York City. Today, we are going to do a demo using products and techniques that I love and I use often. This demo is all about creating mixed media layered backgrounds. You've done that a million times, I know. What's so special or different about this one? Well, I'm using products that are translucent or transparent. And whether or not your products are translucent, semi-translucent, transparent, or opaque makes a difference. So if you're following along, what do you need? You need something that resembles what I'm going to show you. It doesn't have to be exact. Let me just put that down there. You're going to need a stencil, a stamp. Of course, when I say one, I mean more. Some sponges, an ink pad, and you're going to need some form of liquid that's translucent or transparent. And I am using, yes, the Mattints from Paper Artsy, and I will explain what those are all about. And you need something to work on. So I'm going to be working on white cardstock with a stencil, multiple stamps, multiple sponges, probably multiple, lots of ink pads, and lots of colors of Mattints. There's a few other things that we might throw in, but that is the basics. So you can always press pause, gather your supplies, and come right back. All right, so we are going to be working on white cardstock. I don't always work on cardstock, but cardstock is thick enough that it's a good base. You know, it's thicker than printer paper, but it's not all that expensive in case you're just practicing and you don't want to use your best watercolor paper. This is also good to do in a journal. I am highlighting right now that we are using white cardstock because we are using transparent supplies, and transparent supplies do not work well on dark backgrounds. All right, I'm going to start laying down my background with one of my new Paper Artsy stamps. Of course, if you're watching this in the year 2030, they won't be new anymore, but I'm using EM 110. You can choose to, for what I'm doing today, use an acrylic block or not. Let's kind of go both ways and mix it up a little bit. I'm going to use today ink pads that are relatively light in color. And also, most of the ones I'm going to be using are the Tim Holtz Distress ink pads because they are dye-based ink and they're translucent. And this is a new ink pad that I've been obsessed with. It's from Hata, and it is a oil-based ink pad. It has some translucency to it, so it also works. So what I'm going to do is just ink up my stamp, and I'm going to add this in the background. If my stamp were very fresh, I might press it off a little bit on the side because I don't want something here that's dark and dramatic. I am looking for this sense of lightness so that there is a base for all the other translucent, transparent materials, and nothing screams, but rather everything blends and melds together. I'm definitely going to stamp multiple times so that some areas are a little darker than others. And I am specifically in my head designing as I go. And when I say designing, I'm thinking of a very loose pattern that I want to create. I don't have it in mind before I start it. I'm just letting the layer tell me where to go. And I'm moving it along. I'm going to take it off the acrylic block. And I'm just going to press in some areas. This way I get different shapes. I get different amount of pressure. So the color could be lighter or darker. And I don't get the entire stamp stamped over 55,000 times, but rather I get my own pattern that probably nobody else would exactly recreate. All right, now you certainly don't have to use that muddy color, which I love, and you certainly don't have to fill the entire sheet up with that one stamp. But for me, I like my first layer to be pretty consistent, and I like all my other layers to start breaking up over. Let's go in with one of Tim's colors and just add a little bit of contrast with a different color, same stamp. And the reason why I do that is because I always feel that when you use the same stamp layered over itself with another color, you begin to create dimension and depth. Obviously, you're also getting some color blending and some variation, but for me, it's more, this already gives the look very simply like there's multiple layers. And also, because that first layer was really quite dull, this brightens it up. And yeah, I heard everybody laughing that anybody would think this was bright. All right. I'm going to do the same thing, but with another stamp. And this stamp, while it is very linear and blotchy, I am now going to look for a stamp that might have a little bit less blotch and a little bit more definition. So I love 110 because even though it's linear, because it's in a line, it's got those spots. And I think that would be a really, really nice contrast to these lines. And I'm not going to use the block because I don't want lines of dots. I just want some random dots. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to get some peacock feathers. I'm choosing that for two reasons. And this is important in terms of the way I layer. I layer with the notion of contrasts in mind. These colors here are warm. You know, they're warm tones, sort of the browns and the sort of golden yellows. And then this is a cool tone, the peacock feathers. It's a more of a teal. So it's a cool tone. And then it's also a little bit not only different in shade, but it's going to be a little bit different in depth and richness too. It's a much brighter color compared to these muted tones. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to ink the stamp. And I want to remind you again, it's easy to forget. I'm not looking for big spots. I want soft spots to start blending in. So if it was a particularly fresh ink pad, I'm going to stamp it off and then I'm going to stamp it on. That way, I'm beginning to add some color and some spotting, but it's not dramatic. It's not going to become a focal point. It's going to get lost in the background, and I'm going to keep doing that, but I want you to see what that looks like. One of the things I do, by the by, is I let my ink pads dry out. Happens anyway, but I do that because I tend to like, for my backgrounds, this sense of softness and blending. And a dry ink pad is a dry-ish ink pad, let me correct that, is perfect for that. All right. I think that's more than enough. Remember, we're building lots of layers, so this is just the beginning. But what I am noticing is I'm noticing that as a composition, this trails off here. I think I wanted to extend just a bit. So I am going to take a moment. I'm going to go back to the original stamp I used. And I'm going to bring it out. So it has a little bit more of a sense of movement and dimension, almost as if that's an arrow pointing you off the page. And again, I'm going to use both colors that I used originally. There we go. And while I have it, why not, right? Okay. All right, so I'm going to use one more stamp because, again, 3, that's the magic number. So the first stamp I used with sort of these linear, almost like grid lines, skid marks. And then I used these spotty dots. I want to use something that's a little bit more open. I'm going to use these circles. This is 106, and I really like the fact that they have these really small numbers in them. I like that in general, but I like that here, that there's not going to be anything that I'm using right now, at least, that is anything but a mark. And I really, really like the fact that there'll be some identifiable symbol there. And again, 106. So let's start it on a block. I'm going to go with maybe another warm tone. So I started with the warm tones, went to a cool tone. Now I'm going to go back to the warm tone. I'm going to be using Wild Honey. And start off the edge here. And so did you see how that brings in a little bit more of a place where the eye can go? And although it might be hard to see initially, there are those numbers. This looks like a hot mess. And I'm okay with that, because your layers along the way probably should be hot messes. Most people get freaked out. For me, I feel like if I have a hot mess along the way, I know I'm on to something. All right, I'm just going to bring that over a little bit. And I'm going to bring the edge up and the edge down there. Okay. All right, let's move on from stamps, although I am coming back later to use another stamp. And now I want to move on to the Mattints. The Mattints, yes. So some of you know what Mattints are. Other people are saying, what is he saying? So Mattints are a product that have been put out from Paper Artsy. There are now 12 colors. They have a new release recently of these 4 colors. And at first glance, these 2 look similar, but they're really not. So let me just tell you about Mattints, and then I'm going to demo some Mattints. And no one really knew how to pronounce Mattints to begin with. And then Leandra, who owns the company, she basically was saying, think about it. These are matte tints, but they're yours. You know, once you buy them, they're yours. So they're Mattints. You know, not my tints, but they're Mattints. All right, enough of that. So Mattints are water-based, matte finished, tinted glazes and adhesives. I'm going to say that again. They are water-based, matte finished, tinted glazes and adhesives. And most importantly, well, all that is important, but most importantly is that they are fully transparent. What does that mean? Well, when you have a paint, you know, sometimes the paint is opaque. So you can see Fuzzy Cactus is opaque. We know that for 2 reasons. One, because it says opaque. But the other reason is because that swipe, all you see is paint. Rusty is translucent. How do we know? Because it says it. But also because you see the chevrons underneath. And when you're working in mixed media layers, it's so important to know if you have translucent or opaque materials, because they do different things. And trust me when I say, after you've spent 17 hours on a piece, you don't want a layer that final layer with a full layer of opaque paint because everything underneath goes away. You might want to do it with translucent. And if you want your stencil design to show up on a busy background, you're probably not going to use translucent. You're probably going to use opaque. So it's really an important quality. But these are, and sometimes people ask, like, what's the difference between the word? Here's the difference. These are translucent. It means you can see through them. But do you see how those black lines, those lines are as black as the word paper artsy? They are kind of softened and muted. It's because it's translucent. You can see through it, but you still get the cloudy paint and the color. Mattints are full on transparent. You see right through them. You know, I see right through you, Mattint. So before I demo on my piece, I just want to demo on a piece of white cardstock along with a piece of black cardstock. And this is going to really clarify how these are used. And I should mention too, these are not paints. This is not a paint. This is a matte finished water-based tinted glaze and adhesive that's fully transparent that acts as a sealer to your work. And you can, because of its matte finish, write over it and use any product over it, but it's not paint. Probably the closest thing it's similar to is like a tinted fluid matte medium. Think about it. Matte medium we use for collage. This is perfect for collage. And so this one's river deep. And squeeze it on my mat. I'm going to take very little. I'm squeezing so softly because I don't want it all to pour out. That might be too little. And I'm going to put it on the white cardstock. And I'm just going to layer it out. These are for a beautifully soft finish. Really soft. They're kind of dreamy and soft. And again, they're completely see-through. What happens when I put this blue on black? Don't adjust your cameras at home, my friends. This is what happens. It disappears. I mean, it's there. There it is. But it disappears because it's transparent. So you need to know, rule number one, when you use the Mattints, you do not use them on a dark background. So now that I've done that, what are we doing today? We are going back to our base. And we're going to get a stencil. I'm going to choose this stencil. This one's my stencils from Stencil Girl. It's called Vessel. Just to make sure you see what it's like. It's that. This is still so muted. I'm going to bring in some bright. So I'm just going to go right to the pink. And I'm going to squeeze just a bit out on my mat. I'm going to get a sponge. You can use a craft sponge. I tend to use the makeup sponges. Put a little bit on. I'm just going to layer my stencil down, and I'm going to pounce. And I'm not in any way, shape, or form interested in having the entire stencil show. This is about me making a creative decision on the fly in terms of where I'm going to place my elements. I'm going to do that a few times, and I really want you to be aware this is very different effect than you get with paint, even translucent paint, because the colors are so see-through and so soft. If you love the softness in particular, you can absolutely skip that first step. That's the one where I layered some stamps. You can just focus on these layers without any other layers. But you see the dimension that that brings? It brings so much dimension because you can see through everything. So it's now beginning to feel that these layers are stacking. And it's also beginning to feel like there's so much more than I've actually done, because the transparency allows you to see everything underneath, and it shifts the color. So over this color, it's different than over that color. It's different when it's over that color. And you begin to get, without any effort or overthinking, you just begin to get this shifting of color. All right, I'm going in. I got splattered a bit. That's only cool. Maybe I'll use a different part of the sponge because I will get some color mixing, which I'm fine with, but let's try to keep it somewhat pure just for the purposes of the demo. I'm going in with the exact same stencil and I'm adding a different color. This time I'm using Dragonfly. That you do have to be careful when you use cardstock, because the wetness from the Mattints, because they're very wet, can sometimes make the paper pill. So you just need to be aware of that. Now I'm purposely also bringing some of these designs off from the central portion, which was designed with stamps and ink pads, because I want all these elements that I'm adding also to kind of free float and bring the images further out. Now I'm going to do just a bit more because I poured it, so I might as well use it. And then I want to highlight something for you. And it's so important when you use this that you have a little bit of sense of color mixing, because this is what Dragonfly looks like naked, one layer. When you layer it over all that yellow, it's green. I didn't add green. It added itself. So it's really, 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 really important to notice what you're putting the colors on because of this phenomenon of layering the different colors. Let's use another stencil. You know, you can't use one. If you're going to do it once, you're going to do it twice. And of course, if you're going to do it twice, you're going to do it 3 times. This one is a stencil of mine from Stencil Girl called Etched. I love this one. I love that it's small. It's just so handy. Some of the larger stencils are unwieldy, and I'll explain later what you do about that. Let's add some squeezed. Let's bring some orange in here. I'm going to go ahead again. I'm going to shift the side of the sponge, and I'm going to bring some of this in. And remember, I want to pull some of this off the edge. Now, the wonderful thing about both the Mattints, as well as the technique that I'm using, is that nothing predominates here. This is not about creating a focal point. This is not about the layers I'm showing you today. This is not about you finishing a page. This is about you creating a transparent / translucent layered background for mixed media. The thing about this is that eventually you'll probably work over it. And because I'm creating a background, my goal is not to have anything in the background, at least at this point, stand out any more than any other element in the background. Sponges are going to get really wet, so I'm going to use a new sponge. This is about just creating that look and feel of almost not even being able to tell after you're done what elements were used, what stamps, what stencils. You know, it's all about the blending and using translucency and just bits and pieces of different materials and stencils and stamps. That's going to lead you there. All right, I'm going to do one more stencil. I'm hooked on threes in art, I'm going to be using one of my favorite stencils. Again, it's my design from Stencil Girl. I love this one because basically it's one stencil, but it gives you 9 elements. It is called ATC Mix Up 2. But it's kind of large. I mean, I like that, but the fact that it's large is only a problem really if you have a small space or if you have some wetness. Let's say I'm working with I don't know, fiber paste. I don't want to put the stencil there if the fiber paste is here and it's going to squish in. So what do? You take your scissor and you cut your stencil. And I know most of you have seen people do this. I know some of you have done it. Some of you are cringing, and maybe there was 1 or 2 gasps, only you know. All right, so I'm going to use this one. I just like this, and I'm going to do 2 things with this. I'm going to go in. I'm going to add some, let's add some River Deep. And then I'm also going to add some ink from an ink pad as well. Again, the idea of using the same stencil or stamp repeatedly with different shades is in part what gives you some interesting depth and dimension. I like this. This is subtle, but I'm hoping you can see. You see it right there? It kind of adds, again, a sense of contrast because it has both a line and a dot. Each row is alternating between a row of lines and a row of dots. I'm going to go with my gut, which tells me to go with something a little darker. I don't want it to stand out too much. Remember, it's still the background. But when I do think a little bit of a darker blue would work. It would add some contrast to that. Maybe a little bit of red, which takes it in a whole different place, and maybe a little bit of scorched timber. All right. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to get a sponge. I'm going to start with some chipped sapphire, and I'm going to put it on the sponge, but I'm going to take it off the sponge a bit. Oh, you couldn't see that, but I took it off a little bit because I don't want it to be the star of the show. I want it to be a co-star. Do I want the co-star to maybe win an award? Absolutely, because I want everybody to win an award, but I don't want it to take over. And do you see how quickly that can take over? I mean, that's no big deal, but my point is that that's where my eye goes now. It doesn't go everywhere. It goes to that. And that's why I like to use a little bit less ink. Now, for some of you, that contrast might be perfect. And if it is, you go heavy. But again, for me, I'll highlight that my goal for these kinds of backgrounds, it's just the start of a piece. I'm going to work over this. But my goal for these kinds of backgrounds is this sense of blending. All right, so let's throw in a little barn door. Why not, right? And we're going to get a little purple now because the red is going to mix with this blue. Oh, yeah, I like that. Oh, I definitely like that. It's getting stronger and stronger and a little stronger. And then let's just throw in a little scorched timber in honor of it being the last new color in the Distress ink line and being an amazing, amazing color. But you know what I'm going to do? Because I can. I'm going to go to a whole nother stencil. I'm drawn to another stencil. This one is called Glyph Grid. And I'm going to add some of this using the scorched timber. It's pretty dry scorched timber. So it's not, I like that contrast though. It's not going to be too dramatic. There's a little more drama. Okay, and as I add some of that, I'm now getting antsy to, oh yeah, I'm getting antsy to start working on the focal points. Now, sadly, my friends, in case you thought we were going to take this piece to the very end, I'm not going to be doing that with you guys because we don't have time. But I am going to add one other element here. And by the by, I just want to make mention, lest you think this is the right way or the only way to do it. It's very clear, if you know me, that I'm pretty linear. So every stencil, every stamp I used was, you know, vertical. I didn't move it at all. That's just the way I prefer the backgrounds in my style. By all means, go crazy and tip it diagonal. Yeah, I gave you permission. So adding that darker color and bringing it up by bringing in the contrast with a darker blue, the scorched timber, which is, you know, sometimes a gray, sometimes a taupe, sometimes a black, sometimes a brown. That's the beauty of this color. And then some red as well, which is also more robust and darker, gives some much needed design element. That's also why I switched that stencil to the glyph grid, because I knew it needed something else. And I actually really like that now. All right, so you know what? I'm going to linger on this for a moment and remind everybody that this was all about creating transparent / translucent mixed media layers, so that when you cover things, you don't really cover things, you just add and blend. And we used stamps, stencils, ink pads that were translucent, and we used the Mattints, which are, can I say it one more time? Everybody say it with me. A water-based matte finish tinted glaze and adhesive that's fully translucent, but it's not paint. And this has left me with, I think, something really nice to work from. How would I work with and from this? That might be another demo in the future, but if not, and I can't hold myself back, I absolutely would start working over this with collage and lots of layers. I want to thank you for joining me. This was, again, in my Mixed Media Tuesday series. It's a demo. I'm hoping that you are inspired to maybe use some of these products, some of these techniques. If you do post any of your work on social media, please tag me. Not everything, but a lot of what I use in today's demo is available at sethapter.com. And if you didn't know, I have an online store there. I want to thank you so much for showing up.